The morning of November 20th, 1943, over the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley, Oberleutnant Karl Heinz Becker climbed through 8,000 feet in his Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav, scanning the cloud deck above for any break, any opening that might reveal the American bomber formation he knew was there. He could hear them. The deep, throbbing drone of Wright Cyclone engines penetrated even through his leather flying helmet, reverberating through the cockpit frame. Somewhere above that impenetrable ceiling of grey stratus clouds, layered thick from 6,000 feet to perhaps 15,000, more than 200 B-17 flying fortresses were approaching their target, but Becker couldn't see them. No German pilot could. What made this mission different, what caused the tight knot of anxiety in Becker's stomach as he circled beneath the clouds, was the radio call he'd received 17 minutes earlier from the Luftwaffe's ground monitoring station at Dortmund. The station's operators, hunched over their Naxos radar detection equipment in a concrete bunker, had picked up a new type of emission. Not the familiar signature of the British H2X radar they'd learned to recognize over the past year, but something else, something transmitting on a slightly different frequency, pulsing with characteristic American timing. The Funkhorchgerät, the radio listening service, had designated it simply as a new centimetric radar, origin unknown, purpose bombing navigation. The transmission had grown steadily stronger as the American formation approached, painting targets through clouds the bombers couldn't see through with human eyes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The ground controller's voice crackled through Becker's headset again, tense and urgent. The radar emissions had intensified. The Americans were beginning their bomb run. Estimated time to release? 90 seconds, perhaps less. Becker pushed his throttle forward, felt the Daimler-Benz 605 engine respond, and aimed for a gap in the clouds he thought he'd seen to the northwest. 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, high-explosive and incendiary bombs would begin falling on the synthetic oil refinery at Gelsenkirchen, one of the Reich's most critical petroleum production facilities, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. He couldn't see the bombers to attack them. He couldn't even reach their altitude before the bombs fell. The cloud deck had become an impenetrable shield, and the Americans had learned to weaponize it. This was the new reality of the air war over Germany in late 1943, a reality that would only grow more desperate through 1944 and into the final collapse of 1945. American bombers, equipped with a radar system designated H2X, called Mickey by its operators, could now bomb German targets with reasonable accuracy through complete cloud cover, through weather conditions that had previously provided absolute protection from aerial attack. German air defenses could detect these radar transmissions. Their detection equipment worked perfectly. The Naxos receivers picked up H2X emissions from considerable distances, providing advance warning that a radar-equipped Pathfinder aircraft was approaching and preparing to guide a bomber formation to its target. But detection without interception meant nothing. Knowledge without the ability to act was simply informed helplessness. The Luftwaffe knew the bombers were coming, knew they were lining up for their attack run, knew almost precisely when the bombs would fall, and possessed no effective counter. 90 seconds of warning, 90 seconds to watch the second hand sweep across the cockpit clock while invisible bombers released their loads from above, an impenetrable cloud ceiling. To understand how profoundly H2X radar changed the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, one must first understand the role weather had played in that campaign from its beginning in 1942 through the autumn of 1943. Weather over Central Europe, particularly during the autumn and winter months, had served as Germany's most reliable defensive asset, more effective than any fighter squadron or flak battery. The prevailing westerly winds carried moisture from the Atlantic Ocean across France and into Germany, creating persistent cloud cover that could last for days or even weeks. Meteorological records from 1943 show that cloud cover obscured potential bombing targets across the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, for more than 70% of daylight hours during the months of November through February. This weather pattern created a fundamental problem for the American strategic bombing doctrine, as it had been conceived and planned before the war. The United States Army Air Forces had committed itself to a strategy of precision daylight bombing, attacking specific industrial targets, transportation nodes, and military facilities, rather than conducting the area bombing campaigns that characterized RAF Bomber Command's nighttime operations. American military planners believed, with considerable confidence supported by peacetime testing, that the Norden bomb site, when operated by a properly trained bombardier under clear conditions, it could place bombs within 100 feet of the target from altitudes above 20,000 feet. This precision promised to destroy German war production systematically, while minimizing the collateral damage that area bombing produced. The entire American strategic concept depended on visual bombing, on bombardiers seeing their targets clearly through the bomb site, making minute adjustments during the bomb run, and releasing at the precise calculated moment when the target appeared in the crosshairs. Weather destroyed this precision. When clouds obscured the target, the Norden bomb site became useless regardless of its theoretical accuracy. Bombardiers couldn't aim at targets they couldn't see. During the first 18 months of American strategic bombing operations over Europe, from August 1942 through the end of 1943, the weather aborted or significantly degraded more missions than German fighters and flak combined. Bomber formations would fly deep into Germany, facing intense fighter opposition and heavy flak, only to reach their targets and find them completely obscured by clouds. Missions would be recalled. Bombs would be dropped on targets of opportunity through gaps in the clouds. Secondary targets would be attacked instead. Or, most frustrating of all, bomber crews would return to England with their bomb loads still aboard, having accomplished nothing despite the fuel consumed, the risks taken, and the aircraft damaged or lost to enemy action during the penetration and withdrawal. The strategic bombing campaign operated at the mercy of meteorological conditions that German forces couldn't control but benefited from enormously. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German commanders understood this weather advantage clearly and planned their defensive dispositions accordingly. Luftwaffe fighter units stationed across northwestern Germany received meteorological briefings before every mission, informing them of cloud conditions over potential target areas. When heavy overcast was forecast, some units stood down to conserve fuel and preserve aircraft, knowing the Americans would either abort their mission or bomb less critical secondary targets through breaks in the clouds. Anti-aircraft artillery units similarly adjusted their alert status based on weather conditions. The entire German air defense system operated with the comfortable knowledge that Mother Nature provided substantial protection during a large percentage of the year. This created a strategic calculus that favored the defender, even accounting for the impressive production capacity of American industry, even accepting that the United States could eventually build overwhelming numbers of heavy bombers. Those bombers couldn't destroy what they couldn't see. Weather would limit the number of days suitable for precision bombing. German industry would have time to repair damage, disperse production facilities, and continue functioning despite periodic attacks on clear days. The belief system that H2X radar would shatter rested on more than just weather patterns and tactical considerations. It reflected fundamental assumptions about the nature of aerial warfare that had been established during the First World War and refined through 2 decades of theoretical development and limited practical experience. The doctrine of strategic bombing, as conceived by theorists like the Italian General Giulio Douhet and the American officer Billy Mitchell, rested on the assumption that bombers attacking in daylight needed to see their targets with sufficient clarity to aim their weapons accurately. The entire theoretical framework assumed visual acquisition of the target, visual bomb aiming, and visual confirmation of results. This seemed self-evident. How else could one conduct precision attacks against specific industrial facilities? The technological limitations of the 1930s and early 1940s reinforced this doctrine. Bomb sites represented the pinnacle of mechanical computing technology, using analog mechanisms to calculate the complex ballistic problem of releasing a bomb from a moving aircraft at high altitude and having that bomb strike a specific point on the ground. The Norden bomb site, developed through the 1930s at considerable expense and, classified as highly secret by American military authorities, represented extraordinary engineering achievement. Its system of gyroscopes, gears, and optical elements allowed a bombardier to input aircraft altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and other variables, then track the target through a telescope while the sight automatically calculated the proper release point. During peacetime testing over the Murk bombing range in California, skilled bombardiers using the Norden sight demonstrated remarkable accuracy, consistently placing practice bombs within the theoretical target radius. This performance convinced American air power advocates that precision strategic bombing could work as envisioned. But the Norden sight, for all its sophistication, was fundamentally an optical instrument. It required the bombardier to see the target clearly through a telescope. It depended on visual tracking during the bomb run, with the bombardier keeping the target centered in his crosshairs, while the sight computed the proper release point based on the aircraft's changing position relative to the target. Cloud cover rendered this entire sophisticated mechanism useless. A bombardier couldn't track what he couldn't see. The mechanical computer built into the Norden sight couldn't calculate a solution without visual input. American bomber crews had trained extensively with this equipment at bases across the United States, practicing precision attacks against marked targets under clear western skies. They arrived in England confident in their ability to destroy German industry systematically through daylight precision bombing. Then they encountered European weather. The psychological impact of this discovery shouldn't be underestimated. American bomber crews had been told repeatedly during training that their mission was to conduct precision attacks against specific targets, that their Norden bomb sights gave them unprecedented accuracy, that they would systematically destroy Germany's ability to wage war by eliminating critical industries and transportation networks. They believed in this mission. They accepted the extraordinary risks of daylight bombing, the exposure to fighter attack and flak, because they believed their attacks would be precise and therefore militarily and morally justified. Discovering that weather made precision impossible much of the time created cognitive dissonance and operational frustration. Crews flew dangerous missions deep into Germany, lost friends to fighters and flak, endured the stress of combat, and then couldn't bomb their targets because clouds obscured them. The gap between doctrine and reality created pressure throughout the command structure for some solution, some technological answer that would allow precision bombing regardless of weather conditions. That pressure would drive the development and deployment of H2X radar during 1943, creating a weapon system that fundamentally changed the strategic bombing campaign and left German defenders in the desperate situation Karl Heinz Becker faced over Gelsenkirchen that November morning, listening to his ground controller count down the seconds to bomb release while flying beneath clouds he couldn't penetrate. The AN/APS-15 H2X radar system that entered operational service with the 8th Air Force in November 1943 represented a remarkable achievement in applied physics and engineering, created under intense time pressure to solve a specific tactical problem. The system operated in the X-band frequency range, transmitting pulses at approximately 10,000 MHz with a wavelength of 3 centimeters. This centimetric wavelength allowed the radar to detect ground features with resolution sufficient for bombing navigation, distinguishing built-up urban areas from surrounding countryside, identifying rivers and coastlines, and detecting large industrial complexes. The radar's antenna, mounted in a retractable radome beneath the bomber's fuselage, rotated continuously during operation, scanning the terrain below and painting a crude but usable picture on a cathode ray tube display in the aircraft. Operating the H2X system required specialized training that began at the Army Air Force's radar school at Boca Raton, Florida, where selected bombardiers and navigators learned to interpret the ghostly green images that appeared on their scopes. The training emphasized pattern recognition, teaching operators to identify characteristic radar signatures of known targets. A large city appeared as a bright, irregularly shaped blob on the scope, its edges defined by the transition from dense construction to open countryside. Rivers showed as dark, linear features cutting through brighter terrain. Coastlines created sharp contrasts between land and water returns. Industrial areas sometimes produced distinctive patterns, particularly if they contained large metal structures that reflected radar energy strongly. The instruction lasted 6 weeks, combining classroom lectures on radar theory with practical exercises using actual equipment operated from aircraft flying over the Florida coast and interior. Students learn to compensate for aircraft motion, adjust gain and contrast settings for optimal image quality, and most critically, develop the ability to match the real-time radar image to known target maps, identifying their position and navigating to the release point despite complete visual obscurity. The first H2X-equipped aircraft arrived in England during October 1943, assigned to the 813th Bombardment Squadron, Provisional, a specialized pathfinder unit formed specifically to lead bomber formations to targets using radar navigation when visual bombing proved impossible. The squadron received 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses modified to carry the H2X equipment, along with personnel specially trained in its operation. Each Pathfinder aircraft carried a radar operator, typically a bombardier who had completed the Boca Raton training, seated at a small station where he could monitor the radar scope during the mission. The aircraft also carried a navigator trained to correlate radar returns with known geography, and a radar countermeasures officer who monitored German defensive transmissions. The tactical procedure developed for H2X operations reflected careful planning to maximize effectiveness despite the system's limitations. The Pathfinder aircraft would fly at the head of the bomber formation, typically leading a combat box of 18 to 21 bombers arranged in defensive formation. As the formation approached the target area, the radar operator would begin tracking identifiable terrain features on his scope, calling out checkpoints to the navigator, who maintained the aircraft's position on his charts. When weather obscured the target visually, the entire formation would rely on the Pathfinder aircraft for navigation and bomb release. The lead bombardier would identify the target on his radar scope, set up his approach, and toggle his bombs at the calculated release point. The other bombers in the formation would release their bombs simultaneously, watching for the Pathfinder's bomb bay doors to open and dropping on that signal. This procedure transformed precision bombing into formation bombing, sacrificing some accuracy, but maintaining the ability to attack through complete cloud cover. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The accuracy of H2X bombing varied considerably depending on operator skill, target characteristics, and radar scope clarity. The system worked best against large urban areas with distinctive radar signatures, particularly coastal cities where the land-water contrast provided excellent reference points. Attacks against inland industrial targets proved more challenging, requiring skilled operators who could identify the target area from subtle variations in radar return intensity. Post-strike reconnaissance photography, when cloud cover eventually cleared, revealed that H2X guided attacks typically achieved accuracy within 1 to 2 miles of the intended target, vastly inferior to visual bombing accuracy, but sufficient to damage large industrial complexes and urban areas. More importantly, H2X allowed the bombing campaign to continue regardless of weather, eliminating the operational pauses that had previously allowed German industry to recover between clear weather attacks. The German Funkhochgerät, the Radio Monitoring and Signals Intelligence Service, detected the first H2X transmissions during late October 1943, shortly after the system became operational with the 8th Air Force. Monitoring stations equipped with Naxos receivers, originally developed to detect British H2S radar emissions from RAF bombers, picked up the new American transmissions on a slightly different frequency. The operators immediately recognized these signals as centimetric radar, similar in principle to the British system, but with characteristic differences in pulse timing and repetition rate that marked them as American equipment. Reports flowed up the German intelligence chain to the Luftwaffe operations staff and to the Reich Air Defense headquarters, alerting commanders that American bombers now possessed blind bombing capability comparable to the British system. The technical staff at the Telefunken research facility near Berlin received captured information about the new American radar and began analyzing its characteristics based on intercepted signals. They determined that the American system operated at approximately 10,000 MHz, used pulse transmission similar to German and British radars, and appeared to be employed for ground mapping and bombing navigation rather than for air-to-air detection. This analysis allowed German forces to understand what they faced. American bombers could now navigate and bomb through complete cloud cover with sufficient accuracy to hit large industrial targets. The comfortable defensive advantage that weather had provided was evaporating. German defensive doctrine evolved rapidly to address this new threat. The Luftwaffe issued tactical bulletins to fighter units, explaining that American Pathfinder aircraft could now guide bomber formations to targets through overcast conditions. Ground monitoring stations received instructions to report immediately when they detected H2X transmissions, providing fighter controllers with warning that a radar-equipped formation was approaching. Anti-aircraft artillery units were instructed to prepare for blind firing based on radar detection and acoustic sound, ranging when H2X emissions indicated an attack was imminent. The entire air defense network understood that the new American capability required adjusted tactics and expectations, but understanding the threat and countering it effectively were entirely different problems. The fundamental issue was timing. German ground stations could detect H2X transmissions from considerable distances, sometimes as far as 40 or 50 miles, depending on terrain, atmospheric conditions, and the bomber's altitude. This provided advance warning that a radar-equipped formation was approaching a particular region. However, detecting the general approach of bombers was very different from determining their specific target and intercepting them before bomb release. The H2X-equipped Pathfinder aircraft would be transmitting continuously as it navigated toward the target, with transmission intensity increasing as range decreased. But German controllers couldn't determine the bomber formation's specific destination until the final minutes of the bomb run, when the Pathfinder aircraft's radar began scanning the immediate target area with increased intensity, typically during the critical 3 to 4 minutes of the actual bombing approach. The operational problem became acute during the final phase of the attack. Once German monitoring stations determined that H2X transmissions indicated an imminent attack on a specific target area, perhaps based on the direction of approach and the locations the radar appeared to be scanning, controllers could alert local fighter units and flak batteries. But the warning time was catastrophically short. From the moment monitoring stations identified the probable target to the moment bombs began falling, rarely exceeded 90 to 120 seconds. Fighter aircraft already airborne beneath the clouds faced an impossible situation. They couldn't see the bombers above the overcast. They couldn't climb through potentially 15,000 feet of cloud to reach bombing altitude before the bombs fell. They couldn't make effective attacks even if they reached the bomber formation's altitude because the clouds disoriented them and broke up any coordinated attack. The warning came too late to matter tactically. Anti-aircraft artillery faced similar constraints. Flak batteries defending important targets maintained readiness during daylight hours, with crews at their guns and ammunition readily available. When warning came that bombers were approaching, they could begin firing into the clouds based on estimated altitude and direction, creating barriers of exploding shells that bombers might fly through. But this blind barrage firing was grossly inefficient, consuming enormous quantities of ammunition for minimal effect. The Luftwaffe calculated that under clear conditions, German flak batteries expended approximately 3,000 rounds of 88mm ammunition for each heavy bomber shot down. Under blind firing conditions against bombers above clouds, that figure increased to over 16,000 rounds per bomber destroyed. The mathematics were unsustainable. The mission against Gelsenkirchen on November 20, 1943, demonstrated with brutal clarity how H2X radar had transformed the strategic bombing campaign and rendered German air defenses desperately inadequate against attacks through weather. The target, a synthetic oil production facility operated by the Gelsenkirchen Benzin Corporation, represented exactly the type of critical infrastructure that German forces needed to protect. The plant processed coal into synthetic petroleum products using the Fischer-Tropsch process, producing approximately 240,000 tons of fuel annually, roughly 4% of Germany's total synthetic fuel production. Destroying or significantly damaging this facility would directly impact Luftwaffe operations and Wehrmacht mobility. The 8th Air Force dispatched 236 B-17 bombers toward the Ruhr Valley that morning, with the bomber stream forming up over England before setting course for Germany at 08:30 hours. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had reported solid overcast across the entire target area from 6,000 feet to 14,000 feet, with some breaks above 15,000 feet but complete cloud cover at all altitudes below. Under previous operational conditions, this weather would have forced cancellation or diversion to secondary targets. Instead, mission planners assigned 3 Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H2X radar to lead separate combat boxes, each Pathfinder responsible for guiding approximately 70 bombers to the target and controlling bomb release. The 8th Air Force dispatched 236 B-17 bombers toward the Ruhr Valley that morning, with the bomber stream forming up over England before setting course for Germany at 08:30 hours. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had reported solid overcast across the entire target area, from 6,000 feet to 14,000 feet, with some breaks above 15,000 feet but complete cloud cover at all altitudes below. Under previous operational conditions, this weather would have forced cancellation or diversion to secondary targets. Instead, mission planners assigned 3 Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H2X radar to lead separate combat boxes, each Pathfinder responsible for guiding approximately 70 bombers to the target and controlling bomb release. Oberleutnant Becker's fighter Gruppe received scramble orders at 09:15 hours when German monitoring stations detected the approaching bomber stream approximately 80 kilometers west of the German border. His unit, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustavs from an airfield near Dortmund, climbed through the overcast and assembled above the clouds at 18,000 feet, where visibility was excellent in bright sunshine above the grey sea of stratus. Controllers vectored the fighters toward the estimated bomber track, providing running commentary on the Americans' progress based on radar detection and monitoring of radio communications. At 09:40 hours, controllers warned that monitoring stations had detected H2X transmissions, indicating the bomber formation included Pathfinder aircraft capable of radar bombing. The fighters continued their patrol above the clouds, waiting for the bombers to appear. They never did. The American formation flew its entire bomb run beneath the cloud tops, maintaining altitude around 12,000 to 13,000 feet, below the overcast ceiling but above the maximum effective altitude for light flak. Becker and his fellow pilots circled uselessly above the clouds, able to hear the bomber engines clearly but unable to see the aircraft or attack them. At 09:53 hours, the ground controller's voice became urgent. Monitoring stations reported that H2X transmissions had intensified significantly. The Pathfinder aircraft were scanning the immediate target area. Bomb release was imminent. Estimated time, 90 seconds. Becker pushed his control stick forward and dove into the clouds, hoping desperately to descend through the overcast quickly enough to make even one firing pass before the bombs fell. The Bf 109 plunged into grey obscurity. Ice began forming immediately on the windscreen and canopy frame. The artificial horizon tumbled briefly before resettling. Becker flew on instruments, watching his altimeter unwind through 12,000 feet, 11,000, 10,000. At 8,000 feet he broke out beneath the clouds into hazy visibility. He looked up immediately, scanning for the bombers he knew were above him. Nothing visible, only the grey cloud ceiling and the sound of engines. He checked his watch. The 90 seconds had elapsed. Somewhere above, bombs were already falling. The first explosions erupted across the Gelsenkirchen facility at 09:55 hours. High-explosive bombs cratered roadways, destroyed storage tanks, and damaged processing buildings. Incendiaries started fires in coal stockpiles and ignited petroleum products leaking from ruptured pipelines. The attack lasted approximately 3 minutes, as successive waves of bombers released their loads over the target area, guided by the Pathfinder aircraft whose radar operators had identified the industrial complex on their scopes and called bomb release at the calculated point. Becker, still climbing desperately toward the cloud base, could only watch the smoke columns rising from the burning plant, knowing the bombers were already turning away above the overcast, beginning their withdrawal toward England and safety. He had never seen them. He had never fired a shot. The entire defensive effort had accomplished precisely nothing. The Gelsenkirchen attack on November 20, 1943, marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in the strategic bombing campaign that would accelerate through the winter months and into 1944. The 8th Air Force conducted 73 major bombing missions between November 1943 and March 1944, a period when weather conditions over Central Europe traditionally provided maximum protection to German industry. Of those 73 missions, 41 required H2X radar guidance for at least part of the attacking force due to complete cloud cover over primary targets. The weather shield that had protected German industry during previous winters had become operationally irrelevant. American bombers could now attack regardless of meteorological conditions, maintaining continuous pressure on German war production throughout the year without the seasonal pauses that had previously allowed recovery and repair. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots proved as significant as the tactical consequences. Men like Oberleutnant Becker, who had entered the war confident in their superior training and the effectiveness of German air defences, found themselves rendered impotent by technology they couldn't counter. Combat reports from Luftwaffe units during this period reflect growing frustration and declining morale, as pilots described mission after mission, where they patrolled uselessly beneath or above clouds, while American bombers struck targets they couldn't defend. The professional fighter pilot's fundamental purpose, to engage and destroy enemy bombers before they could attack German territory, had become impossible to fulfill during a large percentage of operational missions. They could hear the bombers. Their ground controllers could detect the radar emissions and provide warning. But warning without the ability to intercept was merely advanced notification of failure. German tactical doctrine evolved in response to H2X operations, but the available countermeasures proved inadequate. Fighter units received instructions to patrol at medium altitudes beneath typical cloud layers, hoping to catch bomber formations either below the overcast or during breaks in the clouds. This tactic occasionally succeeded when weather conditions were variable, with gaps that allowed visual contact, but against formations flying their entire mission above solid overcast, it accomplished nothing except wasted fuel and frustrated pilots. Some units experimented with climbing through clouds to reach bomber altitudes using instrument flying, then attempting to locate the formations by sound or through brief visual contact during turns. This proved extraordinarily dangerous, disorienting pilots in the clouds, and leading to several instances of spatial disorientation and collision between German fighters maneuvering blindly in the overcast. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force, equipped with airborne radar for intercepting RAF bombers in darkness, possessed the theoretical capability to locate American formations above clouds using their onboard detection equipment. However, the Liechtenstein radar sets installed in German night fighters operated on longer wavelengths, optimized for detecting aircraft at ranges of several miles, not for the precision positioning needed for daylight interception in clouds. Additionally, reassigning night fighter units to day missions meant abandoning the night air defense of German cities, creating vulnerabilities that RAF Bomber Command would immediately exploit. The Germans faced an impossible resource allocation problem, forced to choose which threat to counter while accepting that they lacked sufficient assets to address both effectively. Industrial targets struck during H2X guided missions sustained significant damage despite the system's limited accuracy compared to visual bombing. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs, taken when weather eventually cleared, revealed that radar-guided attacks typically impacted within 1 to 2 miles of the intended aim point. Against large industrial complexes like synthetic fuel plants, marshalling yards, and aircraft production facilities, this accuracy sufficed to cause substantial destruction and disruption. The Gelsenberg facility at Gelsenkirchen sustained damage that reduced production by approximately 30% for 6 weeks following the November 20th attack. Subsequent radar-guided missions during December and January caused additional damage that cumulatively reduced the plant's output by roughly half through the first quarter of 1944. Similar patterns repeated at targets across the Ruhr Valley and other industrial regions as H2X-equipped formations attacked systematically regardless of weather. The introduction of H2X radar fundamentally altered the strategic calculus that had governed the air war over Europe since American daylight bombing operations began in earnest during 1942. Previously, German industrial planners and military commanders could rely on weather to provide periodic respite from attacks, allowing time for damage assessment, debris clearance, and reconstruction. The predictable rhythm of the bombing campaign, intensive during clear weather and absent during extended periods of cloud cover, had enabled German industry to maintain production through rapid repair and adaptation. Factories struck during visual bombing attacks in summer would be partially or fully repaired during autumn and winter, when cloud cover prevented follow-up raids. This pattern allowed Germany to sustain industrial output at levels that, while declining, remained sufficient to equip military forces and continue the war. H2X eliminated these recovery periods. American bombers could now attack throughout the year with only minimal reduction in operational tempo during periods of adverse weather. Damaged facilities faced repeated attacks before repairs could be completed. Industrial complexes that survived one raid faced another within days or weeks, preventing recovery and causing a cumulative degradation of production capacity. The synthetic fuel industry, critical for maintaining Luftwaffe operations and Wehrmacht mobility, proved particularly vulnerable to this sustained pressure. The Fischer-Tropsch plants that converted coal into petroleum products were large fixed installations that produced distinctive radar signatures. H2X equipped formations attacked these facilities repeatedly through the winter of 1943 and 44, systematically reducing German synthetic fuel production at a rate that would prove catastrophic by mid-1944. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate industrial damage to affect German defensive dispositions and resource allocation. The Luftwaffe faced escalating fuel shortages as synthetic production declined, forcing reductions in training hours for new pilots and limiting the operational tempo of fighter units. Pilots arrived at combat units with fewer flight hours and less tactical training than their predecessors, reducing their effectiveness and survival rates. Experienced pilots were killed or seriously wounded at rates exceeding replacement, eroding the Luftwaffe's most valuable and irreplaceable asset: skilled airmen who understood how to fight effectively despite mounting disadvantages. By mid-1944, the German fighter force would face a crisis where aircraft production remained relatively strong, but the pilots to fly them and the fuel to operate them had become critically scarce. The anti-aircraft artillery arm consumed enormous resources in a largely futile attempt to counter radar-guided bombing through Overcast. Flak batteries defending major industrial targets fired thousands of rounds blindly into clouds whenever monitoring stations warned of approaching H2X-equipped formations, hoping that statistically some small percentage of shells would detonate near bombers and cause damage. The actual effectiveness of this blind barrage firing was minimal, but the ammunition consumption was staggering. Germany's overstretched industrial base struggled to produce sufficient flak ammunition while simultaneously meeting the needs of ground forces fighting on multiple fronts. Resources diverted to flak production meant fewer shells for artillery supporting ground combat, fewer anti-tank weapons for defending against Soviet armored offensives, and fewer resources available for other critical needs. The desperation of Germany's situation manifested in increasingly extreme defensive measures proposed and sometimes implemented during 1944. Luftwaffe commanders discussed ramming attacks, where fighter pilots would deliberately collide with bombers, sacrificing themselves to destroy the enemy aircraft. Some units experimented with heavy-caliber rocket weapons fired from beyond effective defensive gun range, hoping to break up bomber formations or force them to abandon their attack runs. Engineers proposed fantastic schemes, including aerial minefields suspended from balloons, massive smoke generators to conceal entire industrial regions, and long-range surface-to-air rockets. None of these desperate measures addressed the fundamental problem. American bombers equipped with H2X radar could attack through weather that made conventional interception impossible, and German forces possessed no effective counter to this capability, given their resource constraints and technological limitations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of this strategic transformation appeared most starkly in the combat reports and personal accounts of German fighter pilots who served during this period. These men faced an impossible situation that destroyed morale and generated a pervasive sense of futility. They flew combat missions knowing that visibility conditions might make interception impossible, regardless of their skill or courage. They watched bombers strike targets they were supposed to defend while circling uselessly above or below clouds, listening to the explosions and seeing smoke rising but unable to engage the enemy. They understood intellectually that Germany was losing the air war, that American industrial production had created overwhelming numerical superiority, and that technological developments like H2X radar were rendering German defenses increasingly ineffective. Flying combat missions under these conditions required a particular kind of courage that accepted likely death or injury, while recognizing that individual sacrifice would not alter strategic outcomes. Oberleutnant Karl Heinz Becker survived the war, though his fighter group suffered catastrophic casualties during 1944 as the Luftwaffe's situation deteriorated beyond recovery. He flew operational missions through the spring of 1944, engaging American fighter escorts, attacking bomber formations when weather permitted visual contact, and experiencing repeatedly the frustration of useless patrols during overcast conditions, when H2X-equipped bombers struck targets he couldn't defend. In June 1944, he was shot down by an American P-51 Mustang during combat over France, bailing out with severe burns and spending the remainder of the war in hospital and convalescent facilities. Post-war interviews conducted during the 1950s by Allied historians revealed his lingering bitterness about the technological asymmetries that had made effective air defense impossible during the war's final years. He spoke specifically about H2X radar, describing the psychological impact of knowing that bombers were approaching, knowing they would attack, and being completely unable to intercept them due to weather conditions the Americans had learned to exploit. The H2X radar system itself underwent continuous refinement and improvement throughout 1944 and into 1945. Improved versions with better resolution and range entered service. Operators gained experience that improved their ability to identify targets from radar returns, and tactical procedures evolved to maximize effectiveness. By the war's end, the 8th Air Force operated multiple Pathfinder squadrons, equipped with the latest radar variants, capable of guiding entire bomber divisions to targets through complete overcast with accuracy sufficient for attacking most industrial and transportation targets. The system that had given German defenders 90 seconds of warning in November 1943 became increasingly sophisticated, reducing even that minimal warning time as operators learned to conduct their bomb runs more efficiently. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, enabled substantially by H2X radar's weather independence, achieved its ultimate objectives by destroying German industrial capacity and petroleum production. Synthetic fuel output, which had sustained Luftwaffe operations and Wehrmacht mobility through the first years of the war, collapsed during the summer of 1944 under sustained attack by radar-equipped formations that struck repeatedly regardless of weather. By September 1944, German synthetic fuel production had fallen to approximately 20% of its peak capacity, starving the Luftwaffe of aviation gasoline and severely restricting Wehrmacht ground operations. Transportation networks, systematically attacked through the autumn and winter of 1944 and 45, degraded to the point where moving military supplies, industrial materials, and even coal for electrical generation became increasingly difficult. The cumulative effect of continuous bombing, made possible by the ability to attack through any weather conditions, proved strategically decisive in ways that the earlier campaign, dependent on clear skies, had not achieved. The technological lesson of H2X radar extended beyond the specific air war over Germany to influence military doctrine and weapons development in the post-war era. The system demonstrated conclusively that radar technology could enable offensive operations independent of weather and visibility, fundamentally changing tactical possibilities. This lesson would inform the development of all-weather interceptor aircraft during the 1950s, equipped with sophisticated radars for locating and attacking targets in any visibility conditions. It would influence the design of ground attack aircraft equipped with terrain-following radar for low-altitude penetration missions. Most significantly, It would shape strategic thinking about the role of technology in warfare, demonstrating that technological superiority could provide decisive advantages that enemy forces couldn't counter through courage, tactical skill, or operational ingenuity alone. The story of H2X radar and the 90 seconds of warning it left German defenders contains profound historical irony that echoes beyond its specific tactical context. German forces possessed excellent signals intelligence capabilities. Their Naxos receivers detected H2X transmissions reliably from considerable distances. Their operators correctly identified the threat and warned fighter units and flak batteries with commendable efficiency. The detection system worked exactly as designed, but detection without effective response was merely informed helplessness, knowledge without power. German defenders knew they would be attacked. They understood when the attack was occurring. They counted down the seconds to bomb release while circling uselessly beneath clouds they couldn't penetrate or climbing desperately through Overcast. They couldn't traverse quickly enough. This transformation of advance warning from defensive advantage to psychological torture represents one of warfare's cruelest inversions, where knowledge amplifies impotence rather than enabling response. The morning of November 20th, 1943, when Oberleutnant Becker listened to his controller count down 90 seconds to bomb release while flying beneath clouds that hid the bombers attacking Gelsenkirchen, marked a turning point in the air war over Germany. Not because of that single attack, which was one mission among thousands, but because it demonstrated clearly that weather had ceased to protect German industry, that technological development had eliminated advantages German forces had relied upon, and that the comfortable assumptions underlying German defensive planning no longer corresponded to operational reality. The subsequent 18 months would see this pattern repeat thousands of times across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories as H2X-equipped bombers struck systematically through all weather conditions, maintaining relentless pressure that German industry could not withstand and German air defences could not effectively counter. The war would end in May 1945 with Germany occupied, its industry destroyed, and its air force dissolved. Among the many technological and strategic factors that produced that outcome, the ability to bomb through clouds using centimetric radar deserves recognition as one of the most significant, rendering obsolete the weather shield that had been Germany's most reliable defensive asset. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.